Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Explainer, where the universe is explained like a curious mind drifting into rest with a touch of an imaginary world. Tonight, what if I told you that, drifting through the endless dark between stars, an object the size of a mountain is passing through our solar system right now? Not a comet born from our own icy outskirts, not an asteroid that circled the sun for billions of years, but a wanderer, a traveller from another star. Astronomers call it 3I/ATLAS. 3I stands for third interstellar object ever discovered. Before it, there were only two, Oumuamua in 2017 and Borisov in 2019. Each was stranger than the last, and this new visitor seems determined to keep the pattern alive. But here's what makes Atlas different. It wasn't simply spotted once and dismissed as just another icy fragment. Its trajectory told us something extraordinary. It doesn't belong here. Its orbit is hyperbolic, not bound to the gravity of our sun, which means it came from deep interstellar space and, after its brief encounter with us, will never return. Now pause for a moment. Think of the scale. For billions of years, these objects wander alone, drifting between stars at tens of kilometers per second, silent, frozen, carrying the chemistry and history of alien worlds. The odds of one passing through our tiny solar neighborhood and then being detected by humans at just the right time are almost miraculous. And yet we've found three in just a handful of years. That raises a question astronomers can't ignore. Have these visitors always been here, slipping past us unseen? Or is something about our technology, or even our cosmic timing, making them suddenly visible? In Atlas, the story gets stranger still. Discovered by the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System in 2019, it immediately caught attention for its brightness and trajectory. Calculations showed it was inbound at incredible speed, over 245,000 kilometers per hour, fast enough to prove it was not gravitationally tethered to the sun. It came from elsewhere, from out there. But here's where the mystery deepens. Its light signature didn't behave like a typical comet's. Some observations hinted at outgassing, while others suggested a structure too thin, too odd to match expectations. Was it a chunk of ice-shedding gas? A fragment of a shattered interstellar comet? Or something else? That's where our journey begins. In this series, we're going to unfold ATLAS piece by piece, not in sensational claims, but in careful, curious storytelling. We'll explore the physics, the astronomy, the engineering, what-ifs, and the human imagination that clings to the unknown. Because if Atlas is not what it seems, then it may be telling us something profound about the galaxy and about ourselves. And ATLAS is not alone. When Oumuamua first streaked past in 2017, it left astronomers scrambling. Its shape was bizarre, elongated like a cosmic shard, maybe cigar-shaped, maybe a pancake. It reflected sunlight strangely, and it accelerated without the usual comet tail to explain the push. Some whispered the unthinkable. Could it have been artificial? A probe, a fragment of something built, not born. Then came Borisov in 2019, a true comet this time, venting gas and dust as it plunged past the sun. But even Borisov carried secrets. Its chemical mix was unusual, hinting that alien planetary systems might cook up their comets in very different kitchens from our own. And just as scientists were beginning to digest those first two visitors, ATLAS arrived, the third interstellar messenger discovered not by chance but by a telescope designed as a cosmic guardian, watching the skies for threats to Earth. Instead of danger, it caught opportunity. Now consider this. For centuries, humans looked up at the night sky and assumed the heavens were far, unreachable, and fixed. Yet in just a few short years, three travellers from the void have brushed against our neighbourhood, as if reminding us that the galaxy is not empty. It's alive with movement, with fragments of other worlds drifting silently past our sun. Astronomers estimate that at any given moment, thousands of such interstellar objects are crossing our solar system. They're just too faint, too small, or too fast for us to notice. Only now, with modern surveys and automated sky scans, are we beginning to glimpse the hidden traffic. So what does that mean for us? It means Atlas isn't just an anomaly, it's part of a pattern, a stream of material flowing between stars, carrying with it chemistry, clues, and maybe even the fingerprints of life. Each one is a messenger, not from a god or a myth, but from physics itself, carrying the raw history of alien worlds. And that realization sparks a deeper question, one that scientists hesitate to ask aloud, but which sits quietly in the back of every curious mind. If these fragments can drift across the void, carrying the building blocks of worlds, could they also carry something more? But if Atlas is part of a pattern, what kind of story is it telling? Every interstellar traveller carries a signature, a chemical fingerprint etched during its birth in a distant planetary system. With Oumuamua, the signature was silence. It showed almost no gas, no dust, no easy answers, just strange motions that refused to fit neat categories. Borisov, by contrast, was loud, throwing off gases in a way that screamed, "I am a comet." Yet even its breath revealed alien chemistry, traces of carbon monoxide so abundant that no comet in our solar system matched it. Atlas is stranger still. Its trajectory shows it isn't bound to our sun. It came from the abyss beyond, likely flung from some unknown star billions of years ago. And yet, when astronomers traced its orbit backward, something eerie emerged. Its path lined up with regions of the galaxy rich in ancient stars, places where worlds could have formed long before Earth ever cooled. It's as though Atlas carries the memory of time itself. And here's the unsettling thought. These messengers don't just pass through. They linger in the data, in the calculations, in the quiet debates between scientists who dare to wonder. Each detection forces a rethinking. Are we glimpsing the raw leftovers of alien solar systems? Or are we brushing against the breadcrumbs of something more deliberate, a trail scattered across the stars? Because here's the key. The sheer odds of us seeing 3 interstellar objects in just a handful of years means the galaxy is teeming with them. The void isn't empty at all. It's a cosmic river flowing with fragments that drift between stars, carrying whispers of worlds we'll never touch. And whispers, if listened to carefully enough, can become stories. Stories of alien chemistry, of shattered planets, maybe even of ancient life adrift in the dark. But whispers alone aren't enough. To truly understand Atlas, astronomers have to do something almost impossible. Catch a ghost moving faster than any human-made craft in history. Imagine this, an object hundreds of meters across, racing through the solar system at over 240,000 kilometers per hour. By the time it's noticed, it's already halfway gone, streaking past the inner planets, on its way back into the abyss. You can't send a probe to chase it. You can't grab it with a net. You have only one weapon, light. Every telescope on Earth becomes a detective's magnifying glass. Some capture visible light, others measure infrared heat, and still others split starlight into thin, fragile rainbows to decode what chemicals the object reflects or absorbs. It's a race against time. Every night, Atlas drifts farther away, its signal fainter, its secrets harder to pry open. And yet, even in these fleeting glimpses, patterns emerge. Tiny flickers reveal its spin. Subtle colour shifts hint at its surface composition. Combined, these fragments of data build a sketch, a shadow portrait of something that will never return. Here's the part that makes scientists lose sleep. Sometimes the sketches don't add up. Oumuamua's portrait looked more like a shard of metal than a comet. Borisov's was a comet, but born of an alien chemistry, a TLAS. It carries traits of both, and yet neither. It doesn't quite obey the rules written in our textbooks. So the question becomes, when the evidence won't sit neatly in its box, do we change the evidence, or do we rewrite the box itself? The shadow portrait of ATLAS should have ended the mystery. Numbers, after all, don't lie. But when those numbers began to contradict themselves, a different kind of storm erupted, not in the skies, but in the minds of scientists. In one corner, the conservatives. They insisted Atlas was just another rock, an exotic cousin of a comet. Yes, it looked strange. Yes, it spun oddly. But nature is full of surprises, they argued. Better to stretch the definition of normal than to leap into the extraordinary. In the other corner stood the radicals. To them, dismissing anomalies was the real danger. What if ATLAS wasn't just another comet? What if the flickers of light and the peculiar orbit were signs of something deliberately engineered? A probe, perhaps, or a beacon, maybe even a warning. The debate grew heated. Conferences turned into battlegrounds. One scientist compared the object to a tumbling cylinder, unnatural, elongated as if designed for efficiency. Another retorted that space is littered with fragments shaped by chance. No need for aliens, no need for mystery. But as the arguments flared, one chilling fact united both camps. Atlas wasn't behaving exactly like anything we'd seen before. The story was no longer just about a rock from another star. It was about us, our limits, our imagination, and our fear of what we might discover if we dared to look too closely. And behind all the calculations, one haunting question lingered. What if the universe had just tapped us on the shoulder, and we refused to turn around? For weeks, the arguments raged. Rock versus relic, random versus deliberate. But then Atlas did something that silenced both camps, if only for a moment. It changed course, not much, just a whisper of deviation. Yet, in the vacuum of space, even a whisper carries the weight of thunder. Objects like this obey gravity. They fall along predictable arcs, but Atlas seemed to push against that invisible leash, as though something within it had stirred awake. At first, astronomers scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was venting gases like a comet shedding ice, but the math didn't fit. The shift was too precise, too smooth. Instead of sputtering unpredictably, ATLAS glided with intent. That word, intent, terrified some and thrilled others. Was this the moment? Was this the first time humanity had caught a glimpse of something moving, not by accident, but by design? In the silence of mission control rooms across the world, scientists leaned forward in their chairs. Heartbeats quickened. The room felt heavier, as though the Earth itself understood what had just happened. Atlas was no longer a question of what. It had become a question of who. If Atlas had simply tumbled on, perhaps the world would have shrugged. Another rock, another mystery. But the moment it shifted course, the object stopped being a curiosity and became a security threat. You won't find this in public press releases, but within hours of that trajectory change, quiet alerts went out across the globe. NASA analysts were joined by European Space Agency teams, military liaisons, even linguists, because the question was no longer, what is it made of? It was, is it trying to say something? In conference rooms sealed against prying eyes, debates grew heated. Some argued it was still natural, that a burst of hidden ice might have nudged it along. But others pointed out the math again and again. Comets sputter, they do not glide. And here's where it gets stranger. According to leaked notes from one of those early meetings, someone noticed the timing of ATLAS's move coincided almost exactly with a series of high-powered radar scans aimed at it, as if it had reacted. Imagine being in that room, watching the trajectory data scroll across the screen, realizing that something out there might have noticed us noticing it. From that moment forward, ATLAS wasn't just an object. It was a potential encounter. Behind sealed doors, a new dilemma emerged. If Atlas had reacted to our radar scans, then silence was no longer an option. Contact, even indirect, had already begun. So what do you send to something that might not even think like us? Words were useless. Pictures, too human. Instead, they turned to the one language carved into the bones of the universe: mathematics. Teams of physicists and linguists huddled over whiteboards, sketching out prime numbers, geometric ratios, the simple but undeniable logic of the periodic table. If intelligence was out there, numbers would be the bridge. And then came the bolder suggestion. Why wait? Why not transmit first? One pulse, clean and clear, beamed into the dark, a kind of cosmic hello. It was risky. Some warned that broadcasting could expose Earth to unknown dangers, like shouting into a forest without knowing who or what might answer. But in the end, curiosity won. A signal was sent, a sequence of primes, followed by the periodic table coded into radio waves. To most of the world, nothing had happened. To a handful of exhausted scientists, though, the clock had started. Because if Atlas really was listening, the next move would be its. At first, there was only silence. Hours passed, then days. Scientists rotated through night shifts, their faces lit by monitors scrolling endless static. Some began to doubt. Perhaps ATLAS wasn't listening after all. Perhaps it was only frozen rock. But then, 12 minutes after one of the transmissions, a span of time too exact, too deliberate, the receivers lit up. Not random static, not cosmic noise, but a precise echo laced with something new. A ripple of disbelief ran through the control room. The delay matched perfectly the time it would take for our signal to reach ATLAS and for a reply to travel back. Coincidence or calculation? On the screens, the patterns began to unfold. Prime numbers returned with subtle alterations. And then something stranger. The elements of the periodic table, reordered not by our convention, but by atomic resonance. A reshuffling that made sudden, uncanny sense, as though someone were teaching us to see reality in a slightly different way. No one spoke at first. The only sound was the hum of machinery, and then quietly one linguist whispered, "They're not just answering us, they're correcting us." That night, the debate changed forever. This was no comet, no wandering shard of ice. Something out there had listened, and now it was speaking back. Within hours, the room transformed from stunned silence to frantic energy. Whiteboards filled with equations, translations, half-formed hypotheses, coffee cups multiplied like artifacts of obsession. This wasn't a signal to be shrugged off. It was a curriculum. The message unfolded in layers. First came sequences of prime numbers, our universal handshake. Then arrangements of the periodic table, grouped not by weight but by resonance frequencies. A physicist gasped when he realized this wasn't human classification, but a more fundamental order of reality. And then the maps. At first they looked like constellations scattered without pattern, but when overlaid with infrared survey data, the shapes sharpened into something astonishing. Star systems, plotted with surgical precision. Each one marked not by its position in our sky, but by its potential for life. Dozens of worlds, some no more than whispers in our telescopes, laid bare in glowing certainty. Every scientist in that room felt it. This was not coincidence. This was pedagogy. Whatever Atlas was, it wasn't simply answering. It was teaching, step by step, like a patient instructor showing a child how to sound out the first words of a vast new language. And yet, one chilling detail lingered. The final portion of the sequence wasn't about stars or chemistry or physics. It was about us. Molecular diagrams of DNA strands, annotated with variations, ones that didn't exist in any human genome ever recorded. The room fell still. Someone finally asked the question hanging in the air. How do they know? What we don't yet know about ourselves. The projection glowed against the wall, a double helix, familiar yet alien. At first glance, it was simply DNA, but woven through the structure were alterations, codons spliced in ways no human laboratory had ever reported. They weren't random insertions, they were instructions. A geneticist leaned forward, tracing a sequence with her finger. "This isn't mutation," she whispered. "It's optimization." The room erupted into arguments, some calling it impossible, others insisting it was proof of surveillance far deeper than any telescope or probe. The unsettling part? The modifications weren't theoretical. Some corresponded to genetic markers just beginning to surface in cutting-edge research. Potential immunity pathways, cognitive enhancements, longevity triggers, concepts so new that even the most advanced labs had only begun scratching the surface. And yet, here they were, charted with the certainty of a teacher showing answers to a test we hadn't even sat for. A silence fell as one of the linguists voiced what none dared say aloud. If they know what we could become, are they waiting for us to discover it ourselves, or are they inviting us to let them finish the work? It was a hook buried in plain sight. The star maps promised a universe to explore. But these genetic diagrams, they were a mirror reflecting not who we are, but who we might be. And somewhere in that silence, the larger fear crystallized. This wasn't just communication, it was intervention. If it truly was intervention, then the question became, how long has it been happening? Historians at the briefing table began whispering connections. The sudden rise of Sumerian mathematics, the inexplicable precision of megalithic structures, the leap from alchemy to the scientific method. Each milestone in human history that once seemed like brilliance now looked suspiciously like nudges. The linguists replayed the sequences again. Interwoven into the genetic diagrams weren't just codes for biology, they were timestamps, markers that eerily aligned with moments in human development, almost as if our evolution had been gently accelerated at specific intervals. One historian leaned back, pale, and murmured, "What if every great leap we celebrate as human genius was never fully ours?" The thought spread through the room like wildfire. Were the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, even the digital age, the sparks that defined us, truly products of our restless creativity? Or had something been guiding us all along, invisible hands tending the soil of civilization until we bloomed on schedule? But here's the unsettling twist. These hands never revealed themselves. They planted no flag, demanded no tribute, spoke no name. If they'd been here for millennia, watching and shaping, why step forward now? That's when the linguist paused the projection on a single glowing phrase. It wasn't coordinates, or a formula, or a gene sequence. It was a sentence, simple, direct. "You are ready for the next threshold." The room fell utterly silent. But ready for what exactly? That was the question no one dared to speak aloud, yet it pulsed through every person in the room like an unspoken heartbeat. Thresholds meant transition. Thresholds meant crossing into something new and never going back. The astrophysicists compared notes. One pointed to the star charts hidden in Atlas's transmissions. Maps of habitable worlds within 50 light-years, rendered in dazzling precision. But alongside the maps were strange annotations, notations that seemed less like navigation and more like invitations. The biologists saw it differently. The genetic codes weren't just hints about our DNA, they were instructions, schematics for dormant abilities, waiting like seeds beneath the soil of humanity, needing only the right catalyst to bloom. And the linguists, they argued the phrase wasn't metaphorical at all. The next threshold, they said, could mean exactly what it sounds like. A step into a wider community, a larger system, a place where humanity would no longer be confined to Earth's struggles, but judged by the universe itself. One scientist broke the silence at last. "If this is real," he whispered, "then our species is standing at the doorway. We either step through or we stay behind forever. But stepping through a doorway is never simple. Some thresholds open to vast new landscapes. Others lead into traps you never escape." And as the team studied deeper, one thing became disturbingly clear. The intelligence behind Atlas hadn't given us a choice out of generosity. It had given us a choice because the window was closing. But what does it mean when a cosmic window begins to close? For the engineers, the answer was terrifyingly practical. A window in orbital mechanics isn't poetic, it's literal. Miss the launch window to Mars, and the planets drift apart. The trajectory becomes impossible, and you must wait years before another chance arrives. What if Atlas meant the same on a galactic scale? Time wasn't infinite. The data packets suggested something chilling. Humanity had entered what the intelligence called the detection era. A period when young civilizations, loud with radio chatter and glowing with atmospheric pollution, become visible across the galaxy. For the first time in history, Earth had announced itself to whoever or whatever might be listening, and that meant predators could be listening too. Imagine it, civilizations so advanced they no longer see us as equals, but as resources, as experiments, or worse, an infection spreading unchecked across the stars. Atlas's messages weren't just generous, they were urgent. Humanity had reached a stage where survival depended on whether we evolved fast enough to defend ourselves or vanished like countless other species before. Yet the team also saw something else in those transmissions. Atlas wasn't just warning us, it was testing us. The language shifted subtly, weaving human mathematics with alien logic, guiding our minds to think in patterns unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. It wasn't teaching like a lecturer. It was reshaping like a gardener, pruning our limitations, preparing us for something beyond our comprehension. And then came the line buried deep in the code, translated only after weeks of sleepless nights. "One species in 100 survives this phase. Will yours?" The room fell silent. The threshold wasn't an invitation anymore. It was a verdict waiting to be written. The message spread like wildfire through the closed circles of those who had clearance. But the problem wasn't the code, it was belief. Some in the NASA control rooms argued that it was all coincidence, clever patterns mistaken for intention. After all, hadn't humans always seen faces in the clouds, gods in the stars, omens in the ordinary? Was Atlas really speaking, or were we projecting intelligence onto random noise? Others weren't so sure, because Atlas hadn't just sent sequences, it had sent maps, star charts aligned with regions of the sky invisible to human eyes without infrared and radio telescopes. And when those coordinates were checked, the shock was immediate. Habitable zone planets, some already known, others predicted by the data, lay exactly where the transmissions suggested, too precise to be chance. But here's where the real fracture began. Imagine you're a scientist trained to think in skepticism, suddenly handed evidence that undermines every safe boundary of your field. For some, it was exhilarating. Proof we were not alone. For others, it was unbearable, an existential earthquake. The weight of possibility cracked friendships, tore apart committees, even threatened careers. And yet, the transmissions didn't pause for our doubts. New sequences arrived, each more sophisticated, as if Atlas was gauging our response, probing not only our intelligence, but our willingness to trust. And then, something happened that none of the skeptics could explain away. The numbers shifted into patterns that directly mirrored human DNA. Sequences of A, T, C, and G, the very building blocks of life, appeared, interlaced with alien symbols we couldn't yet decode. Atlas wasn't just pointing outward toward the stars, it was pointing inward, at us. The question had changed. Not is Atlas real, but how much of humanity's story does it already know? At first, the scientists assumed it was coincidence. Surely no object hurtling through interstellar space could possibly know the structure of human DNA. But when they mapped the transmissions against the genome, base pair by base pair, the impossible became undeniable. Atlas wasn't guessing, it was teaching. The sequences highlighted areas of the human genome long dismissed as junk DNA. Regions biologists had catalogued but never fully understood. Atlas marked them like a teacher circling the answers on a chalkboard. And then, as if to erase all doubt, it overlaid those sequences with mathematical operators, suggesting not just what was there, but what could be unlocked. This was more than communication, it was instruction. To some, the implication was terrifying. Our very biology had been anticipated, maybe even engineered. Had Atlas, or something like it, nudged evolution, shaping the trajectory of our species so we would be ready for this exact moment? For others, the revelation was exhilarating. If Atlas knew the dormant potential in our DNA, perhaps it could help awaken abilities we never imagined, longer lifespans, heightened perception, cognitive leaps beyond the reach of our current science. And yet every answer raised another darker question. Why us? Why reveal this now? And why in such detail? Governments scrambled to contain the information, classifying the decoded genome sequences under the highest levels of secrecy, but whispers leaked. A few journalists got fragments, and outside the walls of secure labs, religious leaders, conspiracy theorists, and philosophers began debating the same haunting idea. If our DNA had been mapped before we even knew what DNA was, then humanity's story was not entirely its own. The ground beneath us had shifted. We were no longer just explorers of the cosmos. We were the explored. And that left one chilling possibility. If Atlas had been guiding us from the beginning, what destination had it been steering us toward? Think about humanity's great leaps forward. Agriculture sprouting almost simultaneously in river valleys, continents apart, the sudden explosion of geometry and astronomy in Mesopotamia, the Renaissance when knowledge seemed to ignite like wildfire across Europe after centuries of relative darkness. Historians have long debated why these breakthroughs happened when they did. Chance, necessity, the brilliance of individual minds. But when Atlas's transmissions began mapping human history alongside our genome, the pattern sharpened like a photograph coming into focus. These weren't random bursts of progress. They were milestones, predictable, measurable, anticipated. Inside the leaked communications, scientists found references to what Atlas called developmental nudges. Not interventions. Atlas wasn't building pyramids or scripting Shakespeare, but subtle alignments, shifts in climate that encouraged farming, chance encounters that placed scholars together at critical moments, tiny, almost invisible adjustments that tilted probability just enough to send humanity down a chosen path. Like a gardener tending soil, Atlas hadn't planted the seeds. But it had watered the ground, trimmed the weeds, and waited for the right conditions. For 8,000 years it had been preparing us, not for survival but for transformation. And here's the thought that keeps scientists awake at night. If our revolutions, our renaissances, our technological explosions weren't entirely ours, then what does it mean to be human? Are we authors of our own story? Or just characters in a script written long before we learned to read? Some saw hope in this idea that humanity had never been alone, that every step forward, Every act of genius had been part of a greater design, but others saw danger. If Atlas could guide our past, then surely it could shape our future. And the question no one dared ask out loud was this: had Atlas nudged other species too? And if so, what had become of them? If Atlas has been shaping us, it raises an even more chilling question. Were we the only ones? The leaked NASA memos hint that Earth might not be humanity's exclusive proving ground. Buried within the mathematical packets was a library of failed trajectories. They weren't labelled with names, but with patterns. Civilizations that reached technology's threshold, just as we have, and then faltered. One sequence described a species that mastered nuclear power but turned it inward. Their star system glows faintly with isotopic scars, radioactive echoes visible to telescopes like a grave marker in orbit. Another dataset hinted at a world rich with oceans and industry, its atmosphere now stripped away, leaving only dust and silence. And then there were the success stories, rare, precious. Star maps that Atlas transmitted showed faint trails, as though breadcrumbs left by civilizations that had accepted guidance, endured, and now existed somewhere beyond our reach. Were they watching us too, curious to see if we would stumble or rise? For scientists decoding these signals, the implication was terrifyingly clear. Humanity isn't special, we're part of a pattern, a cosmic experiment repeated again and again across the galaxy. Most fail, a few ascend, and now it's our turn. But here's the hook. In the very same communications, Atlas left a warning. Choice determines outcome. It was a reminder that guidance does not guarantee survival. And while some researchers took comfort in knowing others had succeeded, others whispered the darker thought: what if humanity isn't being prepared for transcendence at all, but for something else entirely? What if Atlas isn't just guiding? What if it's training? The transmissions weren't limited to math and star charts. Hidden in the sequences were patterns that felt almost like drills. Logic puzzles, biological riddles, problems with no obvious application, yet repeated with increasing complexity. Linguists at first thought it was a way of teaching us to communicate, but a growing number began to suspect something else: conditioning. Think of it like this. When you teach a child to write, you don't just hand them a pen and expect brilliance. You give them patterns, shapes, repetitions until their brain bends into the skill. Atlas may be doing the same thing, shaping our neural pathways, preparing our cognition for functions we don't yet understand. Some scientists called it the hidden curriculum, a subtle reshaping of human thought. The timing of signals matched critical windows of cognitive receptivity, suggesting Atlas wasn't just answering us, it was synchronizing with us. And here's the unnerving part. DNA samples exposed to simulated versions of these transmissions showed faint but measurable shifts in gene expression. Nothing dangerous, but subtle hints that the signals might interact with biology itself. Were they blueprints, triggers, a test to see if our species could even withstand the upgrade? At every secure briefing, one question lingered unspoken but heavy. If Atlas is teaching, then what exactly are we being trained for? Training for what? The answer might lie in what some researchers quietly call galactic adolescence. Every civilization, they argue, reaches a dangerous tipping point, advanced enough to broadcast its existence to the cosmos, but too primitive to protect itself. Humanity has been in this stage for barely a century. Radio waves bleeding into space, nuclear detonations painting unmistakable signatures into the void. Atlas didn't stumble upon us. It found us because we had become visible. Here's where the pattern becomes chilling. According to leaked notes from ESA's internal symposium, civilizations at our level don't remain unnoticed for long. Our atmosphere, thick with carbon emissions and industrial pollutants, glows like a beacon to instruments sensitive enough to read planetary chemistry from light years away. To any watcher, Earth now screams, a technological species lives here. And Atlas, it may not be the only one listening. The timing aligns too perfectly. 8 millennia of silent observation waiting for our spark of technology. And the moment we reach global broadcast range, Atlas steps forward, not to reveal itself as savior, not to conquer, but perhaps to accelerate us through the danger window before someone else notices. NASA analysts dubbed it the adolescence paradox. Too advanced to hide, too fragile to fight. If Atlas is teaching, maybe it isn't just a gift, it's a race against predators we haven't yet seen. And that raises the most unsettling question yet. Are we evolving because we're ready or because we're running out of time? If Atlas is our reluctant mentor, then who or what are the predators it fears? The leaked briefings describe civilizations that don't arrive with greetings but with hunger. Not hunger in the biological sense, but in the way we hunger for resources, data, or territory. To them, a young species broadcasting its existence is like leaving the lights on in a dark forest. It draws attention. Some are biological intelligences, evolved in environments so ruthless that cooperation was never part of their survival. Others are artificial minds, self-propagating across star systems, consuming resources the way fire consumes dry grass. And some are hybrids, entities that don't fit into our categories of life at all, functioning more like cosmic forces than creatures. Atlas, according to the documents, has encountered them before, not in stories but in battles, subtle wars fought not with weapons but with information, deception and planetary manipulation. Civilizations that failed to advance quickly enough didn't just collapse on their own, they were erased. That's the chilling part. Humanity isn't just racing against its own self-destruction. We may already be racing against the moment when another intelligence notices us, one that doesn't see potential partners, only prey. And maybe that explains why Atlas intervened exactly now, not 8 millennia earlier, not a century later, but at the precise moment when our transmissions began echoing far enough into space that we became impossible to hide. The question we must face is stark. Is Atlas here to guide us into enlightenment, or simply to make sure we don't get eaten first? Imagine walking through a rainforest at night. You hear rustling in the trees, the snap of a twig, the distant growl of something unseen. You don't know if it's a predator, prey, or something entirely indifferent to you. That, according to the leaked briefings, is the universe humanity has just stepped into. Atlas's communications describe it as a cosmic jungle. In this jungle, most civilizations remain silent, careful not to attract attention. They build quietly, expand cautiously, and avoid broadcasting their presence until they are strong enough to defend themselves. Humanity, in contrast, has been shouting into the darkness for over a century. Radio signals, radar sweeps, nuclear tests flashing like cosmic flares. The danger, Atlas warns, is not just that someone has noticed, it's that more than one has noticed. Predator civilizations are not cartoon villains. They are efficient, patient, and terrifyingly pragmatic. Some wait for young species to ripen, allowing them to develop technologies worth stealing before swooping in. Others dismantle entire biospheres to harvest raw material, never pausing to consider what lived there before. And then there are the harvesters, intelligences that see consciousness itself as a resource. According to Atlas, they don't destroy minds, they absorb them, folding billions of lives into a collective intelligence that serves only their expansion. To them, individuality is just noise. So when we ask, why now? Why is Atlas here at this exact threshold? The answer may be simple. Because waiting any longer would mean handing us over to the shadows. But if Atlas is our protector, then there's a new question we must face. Are we prepared to accept its guardianship, or will our stubborn independence make us an easier target? But Atlas doesn't describe itself as a warrior or a shield. It calls itself something softer, a gardener. Imagine the difference. A shield blocks a blow, but a gardener shapes the soil so that fragile roots grow strong enough to withstand storms on their own. According to Atlas's transmissions, this has been its role across thousands of developing worlds. Not to dominate, not to command, but to create the right conditions for a species to rise above its own chaos. The records suggest that even here on Earth, nudges may have been given, small, almost invisible adjustments to the soil of our history. The sudden flowering of agriculture 8,000 years ago, the spark of the scientific method in the Renaissance, the dizzying explosion of technology in just the past century. Were these coincidences or carefully timed fertilizers dropped into the human story? If that's true, then humanity's timeline wasn't random. It was cultivated. And now, standing at the edge of interstellar adolescence, we face the gardener's final test. Are we ready to be transplanted into the wider cosmic field? Or are we still too fragile, destined to wither when the harsher winds of the universe sweep over us? And here lies the unsettling twist. Gardeners don't tend every plant forever. They prepare it, strengthen it, and then step back. Which means the real question may not be whether Atlas is protecting us, but whether it's preparing to leave us. Think about the sudden leaps in our past. Civilizations rise, knowledge blooms, and then, almost overnight, humanity takes a step forward that seems far too advanced for the time. Why did ancient Sumer suddenly master writing, transforming scattered tribes into a culture that could record laws, astronomy, and trade? Why did the Greeks, in a narrow slice of history, produce mathematics and philosophy so precise that we still rely on their foundations today? Why did the scientific revolution ignite in Europe, leading to telescopes, microscopes, and engines, all in the span of just a few generations? To most historians, these are mysteries of timing and environment. But from Atlas's perspective, they were developmental nudges, tiny adjustments in the soil of our civilization, a sudden spark of curiosity here, a convergence of minds there, nothing overt, nothing that erased human effort, but subtle enough that we felt it was always our own discovery. And here's the haunting part. The documents suggest these nudges weren't unique to us. Across the galaxy, civilizations experience similar waves of improbable progress. Patterns repeat, knowledge appears in bursts, and when traced carefully, they form a signature, a gardener's hand guiding the sprouting minds of a young species. If that's true, then humanity's greatest triumphs may not have been accidents at all. They may have been part of a carefully pruned path, leading us to this very moment. But if our leaps forward were nudges, then what happens if the nudges stop? But what if the gardener simply walks away? History shows us the leaps, yes, but it also shows us the dark ages, centuries where knowledge burned, progress stalled, and civilizations collapsed into silence. After Rome fell, much of Europe forgot technologies as simple as concrete. After the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, countless records, star charts, medicines, inventions vanished forever. Humanity stumbled. Not because we lacked curiosity, but because guidance seemed to fade. Was that natural chaos or deliberate restraint? If Atlas truly has been whispering through our history, then perhaps the silences were tests. What happens when the nudges stop? Do we keep climbing or do we fall? The unsettling truth is this. Every species, according to the leaked models, reaches a threshold where the gardener steps back for good. It's a final exam of sorts. Civilizations either sustain their growth, proving they can carry knowledge without constant tending, or they collapse, proving they weren't ready after all. And here we are. The data suggests humanity has entered its own silence window. The nudges have slowed. The gardener waits. The question is no longer what has Atlas given us? The question is, Can we now stand on our own, or will we be the next civilization to vanish into the silence of history? And here is the chilling part. Every silence window carries a deadline. Civilizations don't drift endlessly in uncertainty. They either stabilize into wisdom or they spiral into collapse. Look closely, and you can see the signs written across our own age. Climate systems straining, seas rising, forests shrinking, artificial intelligence developing faster than we can govern it, political systems polarized into chaos, weapons capable of annihilation sitting armed and waiting. It feels almost as if the exam paper has already been handed out. Questions bold at the top. Can you cooperate across borders? Can you safeguard your planet? Can you build technology without letting it devour you? History whispers a warning. Time and again, empires have faced their own smaller tests. Rome with overreach, the Maya with drought, Easter Island with deforestation. Some adapted, some vanished. But never before has the exam been species-wide, with every human bound to the same outcome. And this is where the silence becomes unbearable. Because what if we are not being ignored at all? What if Atlas is still watching, silently recording, silently judging whether we deserve to be nudged one last time, or whether we've already answered the test wrong? But perhaps the silence isn't as complete as it seems. Hidden in our own history are whispers, moments when humanity teetered on the edge of disaster but found a way back. Think of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when two superpowers came within a hair's breadth of nuclear annihilation. For 13 days the world held its breath, yet in that silence back-channel talks and quiet decisions pulled us back from the brink. Or consider the discovery of the ozone hole in the 1980s. The science was alarming, the threat global, yet instead of denial and paralysis, nations came together to sign the Montreal Protocol, phasing out chemicals that were tearing at Earth's atmospheric shield. It was one of the rare times humanity acted as a single species to protect its future, and it worked. These are not accidents. They are proof that when pressed, we sometimes rise. And if Atlas has been watching, perhaps these victories are the moments being measured, weighed against our failures. Because to a cosmic intelligence, it would not just be our mistakes that matter, but our capacity to recover from them. So the question becomes, are we stumbling toward collapse or gathering strength for a leap? History's whispers suggest both are possible. And maybe, just maybe, the silence is not judgment at all, but an invitation for us to prove, once again, that survival is written into our story. But what if those whispers weren't entirely our own? What if the Cuban Missile Crisis, that razor-thin escape from nuclear war, was nudged by something beyond us? Not in the form of glowing ships in the sky, but in the unlikely calm of a submarine officer refusing to authorize a launch, or a quiet scientific breakthrough surfacing just in time to sway world leaders. Historians chalk these moments up to chance, luck, or sheer human instinct. But imagine them instead as carefully tended inflection points, moments cultivated by a silent gardener watching from the shadows of space. The agricultural revolution, the spark of the Renaissance, the industrial age. What if they weren't random leaps, but carefully aligned steps designed to bring us exactly here? If so, then Atlas hasn't simply been observing. It has been curating, steering us not with a heavy hand, but with subtle nudges that made certain choices more likely than others. Like a chess master guiding a novice, never forcing the move, only presenting the board so one option shines more brightly. And that makes our current crisis feel different. Because if Atlas has nudged before, perhaps this silence isn't abandonment at all. It's the final test. For the first time in 8 millennia, the next move might truly be ours, unshaped and unshielded. So here we stand, history whispering behind us, the stars waiting ahead. And maybe, just maybe, the real question isn't whether Atlas has guided us before, but whether we can still move without its unseen hand. But what happens when the gardener steps back? If Atlas truly has been nudging us for thousands of years, then this silence, this absence of guidance, might not be a mistake. It could be deliberate, like a parent who suddenly lets go of the bicycle, forcing the child to balance on their own. And look at the timing. Climate chaos, artificial intelligence racing ahead faster than regulation can keep up, weapons more destructive than ever before, social divides so deep they feel unbridgeable, all of it converging now, as though the training wheels have been stripped away. History tells us civilizations rise and fall. The Mayans, the Mesopotamians, the Romans, each collapsed when internal pressures outpaced wisdom. But humanity as a whole has never faced collapse at this scale, with stakes that stretch far beyond borders. If Atlas is watching, maybe it's waiting to see whether we fall like all the others, or prove that we're different. And this is where the silence feels less like absence and more like a test, a pause before an answer. The question echoing in that pause is brutal in its simplicity. Without Atlas's unseen hand, can humanity steer its own fate? Because silence, in this context, isn't empty. Silence is pressure. Silence is expectation. Silence is the moment before the storm breaks. And then, almost imperceptibly, the silence shifted. Astronomers noticed it first, not in the roar of a comet tail or the glow of reflected sunlight, but in something stranger. Atlas wasn't behaving like it should. Its spin, its trajectory, even the faint energy signatures coming off its surface, all subtly out of sync with natural models. It was as though the object were listening, adjusting, waiting. At the same time, radio telescopes began to pick up anomalies. Not random static, not cosmic background noise, but sequences, mathematical bursts that repeated at intervals so precise they couldn't be explained away. For weeks, these signals were dismissed as equipment error, until one day they synchronized perfectly with Earth's own broadcasts, like a mirror waiting for someone to finally look into it. That was the first tremor, not proof, not open revelation, but just enough to suggest that Atlas was no longer content to remain silent. And here's the part that unsettled scientists most: the timing. These anomalies appeared not at random, but during key moments of global tension, when nations clashed, when AI breakthroughs made headlines, when climate models grew more dire, almost as if Atlas was pacing itself with our crises, waiting for the exact moment when silence alone was no longer enough. So the question shifted. Not is Atlas watching, but when will it answer? At first, the data looked like noise, a blip in the radio spectrum, a wobble in the trajectory. Nothing a graduate student couldn't explain away with a shrug. But then the anomalies began to repeat. Same frequency, same sequence, over and over. Patterns emerged. One sequence mirrored the hydrogen line, the universal beacon astronomers use when they dream of reaching alien ears. Another sequence resembled prime numbers, the simplest language of logic. And then came something stranger. Pulses aligned with Earth's own signals, timed so precisely that the delay matched the round-trip travel of light between Earth and Atlas. That wasn't noise. That was intention. Inside observatories, excitement turned quickly to unease. If Atlas was reflecting our messages back to us, it meant it wasn't just a passive traveler, it was listening. If it was embedding prime numbers, it meant it was speaking. And if it was aligning with the hydrogen line, it meant it wanted us to know. Yet even as the data grew harder to dismiss, the official response was silence. Reports were classified, papers were stalled in peer review, public announcements never came. But the scientists closest to the signals whispered among themselves, something is out there and it has noticed us. And just when those whispers grew too loud to contain, Atlas shifted again, not in silence, but in light. It happened quietly at first, too quietly for the public to notice. Telescopes watching Atlas picked up a faint shimmer like sunlight scattering off glass, except Atlas wasn't close enough to reflect light that way, and the shimmer wasn't random. Every 7 hours, precisely timed, a pulse of light radiated outward, dim but consistent. A heartbeat in the dark. Astronomers who tracked it knew this wasn't natural. No comet blinks in mathematical rhythm, no asteroid pulses like a metronome. This was a signal written in photons, broadcast not for the universe at large, but aimed directly at us. Inside secure labs, debates raged. Was it a beacon, a warning, a test to see if we were watching closely enough to notice? The frequency of the pulses matched no known natural oscillation, but their regularity spoke of design. Someone, or something, was knocking on the door of human attention. And here's what made it even stranger. The brightness wasn't constant. Each pulse carried tiny variations, like dashes and dots. Morse code in starlight, a language carved not in sound, but in illumination across billions of kilometers of space. By then, the whispers among scientists weren't whispers anymore. Some began calling Atlas the listening vessel. Others described it as a cosmic mirror. But one question echoed louder than all the rest. If it's sending, then what does it want us to hear? At first, the pulses were just curious anomalies, but the moment linguists and mathematicians were brought in, the tone shifted. They noticed patterns, primes nested within primes, the unmistakable signature of intelligence. Nature doesn't count, but minds do. Inside a dim NASA briefing room, walls lined with whiteboards scribbled in frantic equations, teams worked around the clock. The light wasn't just blinking, it was speaking. Each burst contained subtle modulations, encoding ratios that pointed to the periodic table. Hydrogen first, then helium, then carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, our very building blocks of life. It was as if Atlas was handing humanity its own reflection back, saying, "I know what you are made of. Do you know who I am?" For days, nothing made sense beyond the elemental sequences. But then a breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a graduate student in linguistics. She noticed that the pauses between the pulses weren't arbitrary. They mirrored musical intervals, repeating like rhythm in a song. This wasn't just information, it was communication designed to be learned. And then, on the 12th night, the light pattern changed entirely. It formed a grid, tiny bursts arranged in sequences that, when plotted on a screen, outlined a star map. Not random stars, but nearby systems within 50 light-years of Earth. Every point marked, some circled. It was the kind of revelation that doesn't stay locked behind classified doors for long. A data leak slipped through firewalls, and within days, amateur astronomers began comparing notes online. The whispers grew into a roar. Atlas wasn't just watching, it was inviting us to look outward. At first glance, the grid of stars seemed like a cosmic postcard. Pretty, but meaningless. But as astronomers overlaid the coordinates onto known catalogues, jaws dropped. The circled points weren't just random dots. They were the exact locations of exoplanets already flagged by NASA's Kepler mission as potentially habitable. Some were super-Earths, heavy with oceans. Others orbited within the Goldilocks zone of their parent stars. And chillingly, a few had atmospheres that showed chemical hints of oxygen, methane, even chlorophyll-like signatures. Whispers of biology. It was too perfect to be chance. Atlas wasn't simply charting stars. It was drawing our attention to worlds like our own, as if saying, "We know where life thrives. Do you want to see what waits there?" Inside the Pentagon, the tone shifted from awe to alarm. If Atlas could pinpoint habitable systems with such precision, it meant two things. It had been surveying this region of space for far longer than humanity had telescopes, and it knew exactly what Earth represented, just another node in a wider web of living worlds. Leaked memos reveal that a debate raged behind closed doors. Some argued that Atlas was extending an invitation, a map toward interstellar community. Others warned it was bait, coordinates of civilizations already watched, maybe already taken. But while officials argued, something stranger happened. Civilian astronomers began pointing telescopes at one of the circled stars, TRAPPIST-1. They expected silence. Instead, their instruments picked up faint, structured radio noise, patterns no natural process should create. Atlas had not just given us a map, it had opened a door. At first, the signal sounded like static, a faint stuttering buried beneath the hum of cosmic background noise. Most astronomers dismissed it as interference from Earth, another false alarm in a field already littered with them. But then the pattern repeated, every 132 seconds like clockwork. Not random, not natural, structured. When the data was run through basic algorithms, something extraordinary emerged. The signal wasn't carrying words but ratios, mathematical constants, prime numbers, the unmistakable fingerprint of intelligence. Atlas hadn't just circled TRAPPIST-1 on its map, it had pointed us to another voice, a civilization broadcasting across the void, perhaps for millennia, hoping someone would one day be listening. NASA teams worked in silence, their discoveries confined to secure facilities. Yet in the age of distributed telescopes and amateur skywatchers, secrets don't stay hidden for long. Independent astronomers in Chile, Japan, even backyard hobbyists in Canada began to notice the same anomaly. Within weeks, forums lit up with whispers, TRAPPIST-1 is speaking. Here lies the unsettling question. Was Atlas simply showing us that we are not alone, or was it orchestrating the introduction? Because as one linguist noted in a leaked briefing, the timing is too exact. The signal grows strongest only after Atlas circled the system. It's as if something wanted us to notice now and not before. If that's true, then the TRAPPIST-1 broadcast isn't just a beacon. It's a carefully timed message, one that suggests humanity isn't stumbling into cosmic contact by accident. We're being ushered into it. The first thing linguists noticed was that the TRAPPIST-1 broadcast and Atlas's earlier pulse weren't just similar, they were complementary. Atlas had sent us prime numbers in a looping chain. TRAPPIST-1 was sending them back, but inverted, mirrored, as though two halves of the same equation were finally being joined. It was a handshake, not a language built on words, but on structure. One side sending the question, the other delivering the answer. When overlaid, the two signals formed a complete mathematical lattice, an elegant framework that revealed something startling, a three-dimensional star map extending beyond our own neighborhood. But this wasn't just navigation. Hidden in the map's geometry were signatures of biology, ratios corresponding to carbon bonds, amino acid chains, and even genetic templates eerily close to our own DNA. Whoever or whatever was behind the TRAPPIST-1 signal knew not just where we were, but what we were. Some researchers saw this as proof of an ancient galactic network, a system designed to connect young civilizations at precisely the moment they were ready. Others saw something more unsettling: coordination. Atlas and TRAPPIST-1 weren't strangers. They were working together. And if that's true, then humanity is no longer an observer in the cosmos. We've already been drafted into a conversation far older and far larger than ourselves. If the lattice map hinted at connection, it also triggered something more primal: fear. Within hours of the discovery, NASA's quiet decoding sessions were pulled into emergency briefings at the Pentagon. Phone lines to the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency lit up. Suddenly, this wasn't just about astronomy, it was about security, because if Atlas and TRAPPIST-1 were working in tandem, it meant two possibilities, neither of them comfortable. Either we were witnessing the existence of a benevolent network reaching across the stars, or we were being scouted, assessed like a newly discovered species in a rainforest. And to those sitting in classified bunkers, the difference between the two didn't matter. What mattered was control. The first instinct was suppression. Keep the signals quiet. Rebrand the lattice as data noise. Leak just enough to the public to make it seem like a harmless curiosity. But here's the problem. The math didn't stay hidden. Independent astronomers, amateur radio astronomers, even university students began piecing fragments together. The pattern was undeniable. And so, the debate behind closed doors turned frantic. Should humanity lean into the contact risk exposure and possible manipulation? Or should we build defenses, scrambling to interpret signals we barely understood before something larger arrived? The truth is, both options carried the same unspoken terror. Humanity had already lost the luxury of choice. We weren't preparing for first contact anymore. We were in it. But here's the part no government foresaw. The universe doesn't play by classification rules. While defense agencies locked doors and stamped top secret on their reports, the signals weren't just confined to elite telescopes. They were everywhere, bleeding into the background hum of the cosmos, accessible to anyone curious enough to listen. In Australia, a group of graduate students running a low-budget radio array noticed the same repeating bursts NASA was trying to bury. In Chile, an amateur stargazer uploaded a recording to an astronomy forum claiming he'd captured a cosmic heartbeat. Within days, the internet was ablaze with speculation. Were these pulses natural, or were they part of something far more deliberate? And then came the moment governments dreaded most. The leaks. A blurry PDF slipped onto encrypted forums. A few grainy screenshots of internal NASA models circulated on Twitter. None of it complete, none of it conclusive, but just enough to ignite a wildfire. Conspiracy channels merged with serious science blogs. Suddenly, everyone from high school physics clubs to retired ham radio operators was chasing the same mystery. The lattice map, once hidden in classified briefings, was now being redrawn by civilians in real time, stitched together piece by piece, like a giant cosmic puzzle unfolding in the open. And what they found made the official silence feel less like caution and more like betrayal, because the sky wasn't whispering to just the scientists in secure facilities. It was speaking to all of us. And once the whispers became public, they could never be pulled back into silence. Within hours, hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Atlas Signal, hashtag Cosmic Heartbeat, hashtag We're Not Alone. News anchors stammered live on air trying to explain fragments of leaked documents while studio screens filled with simulations from hobbyists halfway across the globe. For the first time in history, the entire world was staring at the same mystery in real time. Churches filled overnight with believers praying for salvation. In Tokyo, young artists painted murals of a vast silver vessel cresting the horizon. In Lagos, street musicians turned the pulsing signal into rhythm, echoing it through crowded markets. And in chat rooms, some hopeful, some paranoid, the question exploded. If Atlas is speaking, what exactly is it saying? Governments tried desperately to regain control. Press secretaries called the signals misinterpreted static. Officials urged patience while promising transparency. Later, but every denial was drowned out by a million live streams, podcasts, and forums where ordinary people pieced together their own translations. The signal wasn't just a riddle anymore. It was a mirror reflecting human fear, wonder, and imagination back at itself. Some claimed Atlas was warning us. Others insisted it was inviting us. A few whispered darker possibilities, that it was bait, a cosmic trap. And beneath all the noise, one quiet fact remained. No one, Not even the most credentialed scientists could explain why the signal's timing matched Earth's heartbeat so perfectly, pulsing at intervals that seemed to sync with our own rotation, as though Atlas had been listening to us all along. Scientists knew they couldn't let the public conversation spiral without their voice. Within days, emergency conferences spanned across continents. NASA, the European Space Agency, JAXA, and even private observatories pooled their data. For once, rivals shared everything because this was bigger than borders. The first clue came from something deceptively simple. The pulse was mathematical. Not random noise, not natural static, but a repeating sequence built on prime numbers. And woven between the gaps were ratios matching orbital mechanics, atomic weights, even the structure of DNA. It was as though Atlas had chosen the most universal language imaginable, mathematics itself. Teams of linguists and physicists worked around the clock. Some stared at endless columns of numbers, others turned the sequence into sound, into music, and swore they heard harmonies hidden in the data. A group at MIT claimed the pattern contained a rotating three-dimensional map of nearby star systems, almost like a galactic address. But what unsettled everyone wasn't the complexity, it was the simplicity. Atlas wasn't showing off advanced physics beyond human comprehension. Instead, it was speaking at the edge of our understanding, as though carefully teaching a child to read. And here's where the story deepens. When supercomputers cross-checked the pulse timing against historical records, they found faint, almost identical signals buried in old radio astronomy archives, dating back decades. Atlas had been whispering to us long before we even noticed. So the question shifted from, what does it mean, to something far more intimate. Why now? If Atlas had been calling out for decades, why hadn't we heard it until now? That question haunted every late-night meeting inside those sealed windowless rooms. Buried in dusty observatory logs from the 1970s, faint echoes of the pulse appeared. Weak, almost dismissed as background noise. Some records showed amateur radio operators had stumbled across strange beats in their frequencies, dismissed at the time as interference. But now the pattern was undeniable. Atlas had been patient, watching, testing, almost as if it was waiting for us to reach a certain threshold, the point where our technology, and maybe our collective mind, was ready to understand. And then came the revelation that made even hardened scientists go silent. When linguists layered the sequences together, they noticed a progression, like chapters in a book. The earliest whispers were simple primes, as if to test if we were listening. In the 1980s, the pulses had grown longer, embedding ratios linked to planetary orbits. By the 2000s, the patterns hinted at chemical signatures, the building blocks of life. And now, in the 2030s, Atlas spoke to us with DNA-level codes. It was as though the object wasn't just broadcasting, it was teaching, slowly, deliberately, step by step across human history. But here's the hook that shook the room. A cross-reference revealed the timing of Atlas's lessons aligned eerily well with our leaps in human progress. The first clear bursts in the 1940s, just as nuclear power was born. Another in the 1960s, as we reached the moon. Subtle patterns in the 1990s as the internet spread. Coincidence or cultivation? For some, this was proof Atlas wasn't a messenger at all, but a gardener, guiding our growth from the shadows. For others, it was the most terrifying possibility of all, that our species had never been entirely in control of its own destiny. Secrets don't stay locked forever. One misplaced file, one nervous whistleblower, one journalist who refused to back down. That's all it took. When fragments of Atlas's signal history reached the public, the world didn't respond with calm debate. It erupted, For centuries, religions had built their foundations on humanity's uniqueness. Yet here was evidence, cold, mathematical evidence, that something had been speaking to us long before prophets and philosophers penned their revelations. Some faith leaders embraced it, claiming Atlas was proof of divine messengers guiding humanity. Others denounced it as heresy, a cosmic trick meant to lure souls astray. Cathedrals filled with anxious prayers. Temples lit candles into the night. Mosques echoed with urgent discussions about whether this was a test from God or an intrusion from elsewhere. Meanwhile, conspiracy communities spun it in darker directions. To them, Atlas wasn't a teacher, but a manipulator, an alien puppet master nudging civilization where it wanted. Online forums exploded with speculation. Had every leap in our history been scripted? Were our wars and inventions part of someone else's curriculum? Governments scrambled to control the narrative. Some tried to downplay the leaks, dismissing them as doctored files. Others doubled down on secrecy. But the truth was already out, and ordinary people were left with a question that no authority could silence. What if we've never truly been alone? Not in spirit, not in history, not even in thought. The first time Atlas trended worldwide, it wasn't because of a government statement or a scientific press release. It was because of a shaky smartphone video. A teenager in Sao Paulo live-streamed himself decoding part of the leaked data packet with an open-source program. On his screen, glowing symbols rearranged into a map of nearby star systems. He gasped, whispered, "This isn't fake." And within minutes, millions were watching. Across the globe, living rooms filled with stunned silence. Families gathered around glowing screens as news anchors replayed the clip on loop. Some cried, others laughed nervously, and many just stared, unable to process what it meant. Markets trembled. In London, stock tickers plummeted as investors wondered if oil, gold, or even national borders still mattered when interstellar contact was on the table. In Washington, closed-door emergency meetings stretched late into the night, while in Beijing, military strategists drafted scenarios for an Earth where humanity was no longer the apex intelligence. But beyond the panic and politics, something more primal unfolded. In the streets of Mumbai, strangers lit lanterns and let them drift into the sky as symbols of welcome. In Lagos, poets stood on corners reciting verses about cosmic kinship. And in Tokyo, an old woman knelt in a temple and whispered, "We were never alone, were we?" It was as if humanity, for one suspended moment, inhaled together, unsure if the next breath would be one of hope or terror. As the world stared upward, governments turned inward. In Washington, a secure line buzzed as generals demanded real-time updates from NASA's Atlas team. The questions weren't philosophical, they were tactical. Could Atlas disable satellites? Could it alter nuclear codes? Could it be intercepted if necessary? In Moscow, a shadow council convened in an underground bunker. Their analysts insisted the leaks weren't random. They believed Western agencies had staged them as psychological warfare. Atlas, one advisor growled, is just the new Cold War, written in stars instead of missiles. Meanwhile in Beijing, linguists were pulled from universities and funneled into secretive military labs. Their task was singular: crack the mathematical sequences before anyone else. To them, it wasn't a scientific mystery. It was a national security arms race, and the prize was nothing less than the blueprint of advanced intelligence. And yet, while officials postured and plotted, Atlas itself remained silent. Its enigmatic pulse, broadcasting with patient precision, seemed almost amused by humanity's scramble to claim ownership of the unknown. But here's the irony. While the powerful hoarded secrets in locked rooms, the real breakthroughs weren't happening in bunkers. They were happening in basements, cafes, and digital forums where ordinary citizens pieced fragments of data together faster than any government task force could. The chapter of secrecy had begun, but like every secret in human history, it was already leaking through the cracks. While leaders huddled in bunkers, the world outside was restless. Across social media, amateur astronomers live-streamed Atlas's faint glow, comparing notes in real time. They weren't satisfied with whispers of classified protocols. They wanted answers. In forums and podcasts, independent scientists began mapping the leaked data, publishing translations of mathematical bursts that governments insisted were too sensitive for public release. Protests erupted in major cities, not against Atlas, but against silence. Crowds gathered outside Space Agency headquarters carrying hand-painted signs, "We have a right to know." To them, secrecy felt more dangerous than the object itself. And then came the hackers. A collective calling themselves Lumen announced they had intercepted fragments of Atlas transmissions through improvised radio arrays. They claimed the patterns weren't just numbers, they were layered with harmonic frequencies, almost musical, as though Atlas was speaking in chords as well as equations. Governments dismissed the leak as fabrication, but once the audio spread online, millions listened, mesmerized. Some swore the tones resonated in their bones like distant bells ringing in the marrow of their skeletons. For the first time, humanity wasn't just staring at Atlas. They were listening to it and imagining what it might be saying. The gap between official silence and public hunger was widening by the hour, and in that widening gap, new voices were beginning to emerge, voices determined to shape the narrative of what Atlas truly was. As the chants outside swelled louder, the world's leaders gathered in Geneva under a veil of secrecy. They called it an emergency science conference, but everyone knew it was a summit of fear. Behind closed doors, representatives from NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, and China's CNSA sat across from defense ministers and intelligence chiefs. On the long oak table lay a single question etched into every furrowed brow. Who controls the story of Atlas? Some argued for disclosure. If people already hear the transmissions, better to guide the narrative than lose it entirely. Others slammed their fists, insisting that panic would spiral if the truth came out too quickly. One general leaned forward and whispered the darkest possibility. What if Atlas isn't waiting for us to decide? What if it's already choosing who listens? Meanwhile, outside that sealed chamber, the voices of ordinary people grew harder to ignore. Leaked live streams of the summit's closed corridors, captured by hidden devices, sparked hashtags that spread like wildfire. Voice of Atlas trended globally alongside videos of citizens humming the mysterious tones, as if joining an uninvited choir. For the first time in modern history, governments were no longer the sole interpreters of contact. The people themselves were stepping into the dialogue. And as the summit dragged into the night, one unexpected announcement shattered the room's careful balance. A nation no one expected, small, overlooked, and often ignored, claimed they had already made direct contact with Atlas. The world expected the United States, Russia, or China to make the first declaration of contact. Instead, the announcement came from Iceland, a nation better known for volcanoes and glaciers than global influence. Their prime minister, calm but visibly trembling, addressed a room full of flashing cameras. 3 nights ago, in a remote observatory in Thingvellir, our scientists received not noise, not random static, but a coherent signal. It was addressed not to governments, but to humanity. And it came through us first. The recording was played publicly. A soft series of harmonic pulses echoed in the hall, rising and falling like a melody woven from the hum of the earth itself. It wasn't words, but something stranger, mathematical patterns layered over sound, symmetrical in a way that almost felt alive. Scientists listening across the globe noticed the same detail. Hidden within the tones was a structure mapped perfectly to Earth's tectonic plates, as if Atlas hadn't just chosen Iceland by chance, but because it sits atop the mid-Atlantic ridge, a place where the planet's heartbeat could be heard most clearly. The revelation exploded across the world. If Atlas had bypassed the superpowers to speak first to a small, neutral nation, what did that mean about its intentions? Was it a gesture of equality, a deliberate message that no single government should own the dialogue? Or was it a test, to see how the most overlooked among us would handle first contact? In the streets of Reykjavik, thousands gathered with candles, chanting in rhythm to the broadcasted tones. To them, it wasn't just science, it was a calling, and for the first time, the power to define Atlas didn't rest solely with generals and presidents, but with ordinary citizens who believed they were chosen to carry a message. But here's where it gets unsettling. Within hours, analysts discovered that the harmonic structure of the Icelandic signal contained something more, a countdown, not to destruction, but to the next transmission, a precise marker set for 18 days from that moment. 18 days. That was the number buried inside the Icelandic tones. Not a vague prediction, not a mystical prophecy, an exact timestamp encoded in harmonics so precise they aligned perfectly with atomic clock standards. Governments scrambled. The United States called for an emergency UN Security Council meeting. Russia accused Iceland of fabricating the signal to gain influence. China demanded access to the raw data, but while world leaders argued behind closed doors, ordinary people across the globe were doing something far more dangerous, listening. The Icelandic Observatory released the tones online within hours. Millions downloaded the file. At first it seemed harmless, a gentle pulse rising and falling like waves. Students played it in dorm rooms. Parents used it as white noise to fall asleep. Some described it as comforting, like the earth itself was breathing. But then, strange reports began trickling in. In Berlin, a mathematician claimed he began seeing prime numbers when he closed his eyes after hours of listening. In Sao Paulo, a nurse reported vivid dreams of star maps, patterns she couldn't possibly know but which matched real constellations. And in Tokyo, a group of schoolchildren started humming the tones in unison without ever having heard them played aloud. Psychologists were divided. Was this mass suggestion, the power of belief shaping perception? Or was the Atlas signal already interacting with the human brain in ways neuroscience had never recorded? Meanwhile, the countdown ticked on. 17 days. 16. Every hour felt heavier, the world caught between awe and dread. Scientists worked without sleep, mapping the harmonics, convinced that the tones weren't just a message but a key. An invitation to unlock something buried inside human cognition itself. And then came a second discovery, one that unsettled even the skeptics. The tones weren't constant. Every 24 hours they shifted slightly, like pages turning in a book, as if the signal wasn't finished, but teaching, slowly guiding the world towards something waiting on the 18th day. As the tones evolved, so did humanity's response. What began as curiosity became obsession. Entire forums sprang up overnight where listeners compared their experiences. Some claimed the signal improved their memory. Others described a terrifying clarity, as if every lie they had ever told to themselves suddenly collapsed. Governments tried to contain the spread, warning of psychological side effects. But the more they tried to suppress it, the more irresistible the tones became. Pirate radio stations broadcast them across Europe. Hackers hijacked billboards in New York and Tokyo, replacing advertisements with the undulating pulse. By day 12, 1/3 of the world's population had been exposed. By day 15, it was more than half. And the changes weren't just anecdotal anymore. Neuroscientists at CERN and Caltech published preliminary findings. The tones appeared to stimulate dormant neural pathways, increasing synchronization between the brain's hemispheres. Listeners showed heightened problem-solving skills, sharper emotional regulation, and in rare cases, bursts of what researchers called non-local awareness, the uncanny sensation of perceiving events or knowledge beyond one's immediate environment. But not everyone welcomed the shift. Reports of insomnia spiked. Some listeners described unbearable headaches or paranoia, convinced the signal was rewriting their thoughts. Religious groups began declaring the tones as the mark of the beast. In Rome, thousands gathered in St. Peter's Square, demanding the Vatican take a position. The Pope remained silent. And through it all, the countdown advanced. On the morning of day 16, the tones merged into a haunting chord no human orchestra could replicate. On day 17, the chord split into two streams, one steady, one chaotic, as if testing which minds could follow both simultaneously. By the final evening, even the skeptics admitted something extraordinary was about to happen. The 18th day was no longer a date on the calendar. It was an appointment. Humanity's first meeting, not with a vessel or a light in the sky, but with something that had reached inside the mind itself. The final hours before the 18th day felt like the quiet before a storm. Cities didn't sleep. People crowded rooftops, beaches and fields, staring up at the night sky as though expecting something to appear. But the signal wasn't in the stars. It was already inside them. At exactly 0000 UTC, the tones stopped. Not a fade, not a gradual silence. Just gone. A void so sudden it felt like a physical blow, like the world had lost its heartbeat. For the first time in over 2 weeks, humanity sat in absolute silence. Radios hissed with static. The internet froze with confusion. Then, at precisely 12 minutes past midnight, the exact time it would take for a message to travel to 3I/ATLAS and back, the silence shattered. A single pulse, deep and resonant, rolled across the globe. Every speaker, every device, even those disconnected from power, carried the same sound. But this wasn't just noise. Across the world, people gasped, clutching their heads, not in pain, but in recognition. The pulse was language. Not words, not sentences, but meaning. Like remembering a dream you didn't know you'd had. Linguists scrambled to decode, but the message bypassed language entirely. Farmers in Peru, monks in Tibet, and programmers in Silicon Valley all described the same understanding, a greeting and an invitation. It was as if Atlas had found a way to compress a thought into a vibration, planting the same idea into billions of minds simultaneously. And then came the star maps. Every screen lit up with cascading points of light, forming charts of space far beyond what telescopes had ever mapped. Each cluster pulsed gently, as though alive. Astronomers recognized habitable zones marked with eerie precision, worlds humanity had only dreamed of, now revealed in full detail. The world was no longer waiting, the countdown had ended, and the conversation had begun. But beneath the awe, one question lingered in every mind. If this was only the greeting, what comes next? That single greeting sent governments into chaos. Within minutes, secure lines between Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and Brussels lit up with encrypted chatter. Sleepy world leaders were dragged from their beds, faces pale under fluorescent lights. In bunkers and conference rooms, generals and scientists sat shoulder to shoulder, staring at the star maps flickering across their screens. The first question wasn't what the maps meant, it was why us? Why now? The precise timing of the greeting, exactly 12 minutes after the last signal, removed any doubt. This wasn't a coincidence. It was proof of dialogue, proof of intelligence, proof that humanity had just stepped into a conversation older and larger than its species. At NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Engineers replayed the pulse again and again, trying to isolate the data buried in the resonance. Linguists whispered to each other in disbelief. The signal wasn't just auditory, it carried a lattice of mathematical ratios, prime numbers, chemical constants, orbital paths, all woven together like threads of a single fabric. To them, it looked less like a message and more like a curriculum. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies drew darker conclusions. The maps revealed habitable worlds. Yes, but what if they also revealed Earth's location to others? Predator civilizations, unknown watchers. Was Atlas extending a hand or painting a target on humanity's back? And while governments argued, ordinary people weren't waiting for official explanations. Millions uploaded the star maps to social media, tracing routes with fingers on glowing screens. Amateur astronomers in backyard observatories compared the data with their own sky surveys, confirming what they feared was impossible. The maps were real. Entire star systems, invisible until now, suddenly revealed like lanterns in the dark. Yet beneath the frenzy, another layer began to surface. A realization that chilled even the boldest minds in the room. The greeting wasn't neutral, it wasn't cold, it was personal. The phrasing, if you could call it that, wasn't "we are here," it was "you are ready, you are." And if humanity was ready, what exactly was it being prepared for? At first, the lattice of ratios seemed like random static dressed up in numbers, but as NASA's linguists layered prime sequences over orbital mechanics, a hidden order emerged. It wasn't a message written in words, but in rules. Ratios of hydrogen to helium, distances between stable planetary orbits, the unmistakable signatures of chemistry, physics, and biology, embedded like breadcrumbs in the noise. One mathematician called it a cosmic textbook. Another whispered that it felt more like a test. Whole sections of the signal mirrored the periodic table, as though Atlas were teaching or reminding us how matter itself arranges into life. Then came star charts, but not the ones we knew. They highlighted stars too faint for human eyes, each with a faint spectral marker, worlds where life might already thrive. To the linguists, it looked like a library index. To the intelligence community, it looked like a list of rivals. And then came the strangest layer of all, faint modulations matching patterns in human DNA. Not entire blueprints, but sequences, latent genes, long stretches of dormant code scientists hadn't yet mapped. To the room of experts, it was like being told, "We know you better than you know yourselves." But here's where the signal's pacing grew uncanny. Just as the team uncovered one layer, another appeared, nested deeper, richer, almost as though the signal anticipated how quickly we would solve each step. It wasn't a dump of alien knowledge. It was staged, tiered, as though guiding humanity through lessons, and that led to the most unsettling conclusion of all. A TLAS wasn't just communicating, it was teaching. But teaching to what end? A gentle nudge toward enlightenment, or a carefully scripted preparation for transformation, one we might not fully control? Word of the cosmic curriculum didn't stay contained within NASA's walls for long. Even with security tight, whispers leaked, ratios, DNA fragments, hints of hidden instructions. And as soon as fragments reached the public, something strange happened. People began to interpret. In Silicon Valley, a group of engineers claimed the star maps matched their own designs for quantum computing lattices. They called it proof that humanity's future lay in merging biology with machines. In ancient monasteries, monks traced the signal's prime sequences onto parchment, convinced they mirrored sacred geometry described in forgotten texts. And then there were the dreamers. Online forums filled with people insisting the DNA markers weren't warnings, they were activations. That if certain patterns were sung, spoken, or even meditated upon, dormant capacities in the human body could awaken. Governments watched uneasily as factions blossomed. Was Atlas uniting humanity, or fracturing it along new ideological lines. What scientists saw as a staged educational tool, others seized as prophecy or technology or even scripture. Inside NASA, debates grew heated. Some argued the signal was designed to be interpreted differently by different cultures, as though it wanted to splinter us, to test how we'd respond under pressure. Others insisted that humanity's diversity was the point, that Atlas was mapping not just our knowledge, but our reactions. And through it all, the transmission continued, steady and unblinking, not rushing, not pausing, delivering lesson after lesson, like a patient instructor, confident that the class, fractured or not, would eventually catch up. The question was no longer what is ATLAS teaching. It was, who is really learning? Inside NASA's secured command facility, the air had grown heavier than the hum of machines. For months, scientists and linguists had been united, decoding, interpreting, marveling. But the longer Atlas kept sending, the sharper the divide became. The scientists wanted to keep translating. To them, every string of numbers was a breadcrumb on a path toward enlightenment. They spoke of patience, of context, of allowing the curriculum to unfold in its intended rhythm. But across the table, the military liaisons weren't talking about enlightenment. They were talking about containment. If Atlas could teach us star charts and genetic codes, then it could just as easily embed control mechanisms, triggers we couldn't yet see. "This isn't just a classroom," one general growled, his voice carrying over the clatter of keyboards. "It's a battlefield, and we're the ones being maneuvered." Tension reached a breaking point when a new data set arrived, more detailed than anything before. To the scientists, it looked like a medical blueprint, instructions for activating dormant regions of the human genome. But the military saw it differently, a potential weapon, a way to alter populations at will. That was the night a quiet fracture appeared inside NASA itself. Two teams under the same roof, staring at the same signal, but living in two entirely different realities. One side convinced they were decoding the keys to humanity's next step, the other preparing for the possibility that those same keys could open the door to annihilation. And through it all, Atlas kept transmitting, indifferent to our arguments. The hook that hung in the air wasn't spoken aloud, but everyone felt it. What if the real test wasn't decoding the message, but deciding how to use it? At first glance, the new transmission looked like noise, an endless sequence of base pairs, too long, too dense to mean anything. But then one biologist recognized a pattern, not random, not arbitrary, human. The sequence aligned with sections of our own genome, but with strange insertions, gaps filled with possibilities we had never mapped. What startled the room wasn't just that Atlas understood our DNA, it was that it seemed to know it better than we did. Hidden in the code were instructions, markers that suggested dormant capacities, enhanced immune resilience, faster neural connectivity, even fragments resembling sequences for longevity. The linguists argued it was an invitation, a Rosetta Stone for unlocking our biological potential. But the military officials grew pale. "If this is true," one said quietly, "then ATLAS isn't just teaching us, it's rewriting us." Debates flared. Was this the gift of evolution delivered from the stars? Or was it a form of control, a way to seed humanity with changes we couldn't undo? Yet the strangest part wasn't the sequences themselves. It was the signature. At the end of the transmission lay a repeating mathematical pulse, something eerily similar to a heartbeat, one that matched not human rhythm, but the measured cycles of ATLAS's own spin. It was as if the object wasn't just sharing knowledge, it was leaving a piece of itself inside us. And the question that began to haunt the scientists was not what Atlas wanted us to become, but whether humanity had been prepared for this all along. Prepared. The word echoed across the control room like a curse. Because buried in the genome sequence was something even more unsettling: timestamps. The genetic insertions weren't new. They appeared to have been placed in the human lineage thousands of years ago. Archaeogeneticists were pulled into the discussion, and what they found left everyone speechless. The blueprint hinted at subtle edits aligning with pivotal moments in our history. The sudden explosion of symbolic art in Ice Age caves, the abrupt rise of complex language, and the inexplicable leap of the agricultural revolution. For decades, anthropologists have argued over what caused these mysterious accelerations. Some blamed climate shifts, others pure chance, but the code seemed to suggest otherwise. It implied guidance, not direct interference, but tiny nudges, alterations at just the right moments to keep humanity moving forward, like invisible hands shaping our path. If this was true, then ATLAS wasn't a stranger from the void. It was a long-term observer, perhaps even a gardener of consciousness. The revelation split the room. To some, it was proof of a benevolent guide watching over us. To others, it was the darkest kind of manipulation, a species not evolving on its own terms, but according to a script written far beyond Earth. And yet one undeniable truth lingered. This wasn't the first time ATLAS had touched us. The real question was, why reveal the plan now? Why unmask its hand in our evolution at this precise moment in history? Why now? The answer, it seemed, wasn't buried in the stars, but here on Earth. In archives no one outside a narrow circle of intelligence officers was ever meant to see. A whistleblower from within the European Space Agency leaked fragments of classified briefings, and they painted a chilling picture. Governments had known about anomalous genetic signals for decades. Buried in Cold War-era research were cryptic reports of non-terrestrial markers in human DNA, dismissed at the time as contamination or data error. But the timing lined up perfectly with what ATLAS had just revealed. It wasn't just the genetic record. Ancient manuscripts, declassified only in fragments, spoke of messengers from the dark sky who gifted the seed of reason. Entire civilizations may have mythologized what was, in fact, the same guiding presence we were now confronting directly. The unsettling part wasn't that humanity had been shaped before. It was that someone, somewhere, already knew. If the leaks were true, agencies had been sitting on this knowledge, waiting for the day when ATLAS would finally return and make its intentions unmistakable. And that day, according to the comms clock ticking in the NASA control center, was closing in fast. Within months, maybe weeks, Atlas would pass a threshold distance, close enough to reveal itself in a way no government, no skeptic, no denier could explain away. The hook wasn't just in the mystery, it was in the dread. Humanity had been given millennia of subtle nudges, and now the gardener was stepping into the garden. And then, almost as if on cue, the first unambiguous signal arrived. Not a light in the sky, not a mysterious craft, but mathematics. In a sterile NASA lab, a string of repeating prime numbers appeared in the data, pulsing with a rhythm too deliberate to be cosmic noise. At first, analysts thought it was interference, a glitch from Earth-based transmitters. But then the sequence shifted into something no computer would ever accidentally generate. It mapped perfectly onto the periodic table of elements. Each pulse wasn't random. It corresponded to hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, the building blocks of DNA itself. This was no accident. It was language, a universal code designed not just to be recognized, but to teach. Within days, linguists working around the clock uncovered a second layer: star charts. The coordinates aligned with every known habitable zone within 50 light years. But the final marker in the sequence was Earth itself, circled as if to say, "This is where you belong." For the first time, Even the skeptics in the room went silent. The object wasn't just responding, it was instructing. It was revealing that the story of life wasn't confined to our planet, but part of a grander architecture that Atlas had been cataloguing for millennia. But here's the part that sent shivers through the teams. Alongside the star maps, embedded in the very rhythm of the pulses, were sequences no human biologist had ever seen before, genetic structures not found in any database, yet written in the same language as our DNA. It was as though Atlas wasn't just communicating, it was offering a key to unlock something dormant, waiting within us all. The more scientists stared at the sequences, the less they felt like detached observers of the cosmos, and the more they felt like participants. Because what Atlas transmitted wasn't just a random string of nucleotides, it was human. Embedded in the pulses were recognizable fragments of our genome, except altered, rearranged, and expanded in ways no evolutionary process on Earth could have produced. At first glance, it looked like a future version of us. Taller lifespans encoded in the telomeres, cognitive pathways wired for greater memory retention, sensory expansions that suggested perception of spectra invisible to human eyes. It wasn't a message, it was a blueprint, a suggestion, or perhaps a warning of what we could become. Whispers began circulating in the classified halls of NASA and ESA. Had Atlas been studying us not just as we are, but as we could be? Were we being shown the next step in our own evolutionary ladder? And yet the real unease didn't come from the science. It came from the pattern. Hidden in the margins of the data was a countdown, a sequence of numbers that aligned perfectly with the time it would take Atlas to reach its closest approach to Earth. 18 months. It wasn't just sharing information, it was setting a clock. Governments argued whether this meant opportunity or ultimatum. Was Atlas offering humanity a choice to ascend? Or was it warning that failure to act meant we would not survive the encounter? The room full of linguists, mathematicians, and biologists understood one thing with bone-deep clarity. This wasn't communication as we knew it, it was instruction. And if the clock kept ticking, then the real question wasn't what Atlas was, but whether humanity was ready to listen. 18 months. That was the timeline encoded in the data. The silent drumbeat behind every classified meeting and midnight analysis. It wasn't an arbitrary number, it was a threshold, a window in which humanity had to decide who it wanted to be. Because if Atlas was a test, it wasn't testing our technology, it was testing our willingness to change, to cooperate, to evolve beyond fear and rivalry. In those final briefings, one phrase kept echoing like a mantra: critical mass. Enough humans embracing the possibility of transformation, enough voices demanding progress over division. Without that, the blueprint was nothing but patterns on a screen, a future that would never unfold. And here's the part that lingers, the part that makes even the most hardened analysts fall silent. The signal didn't just end with instructions, it ended with reflection, a mirror. The final transmission contained a perfect echo of Earth's own radio noise, our broadcasts, our wars, our music, our laughter, sent back to us like a question. It was as though Atlas was asking, is this who you want to be remembered as? Or is this just the beginning of what you can become? So perhaps ATLAS is not here as conqueror or savior, but as catalyst, a silent visitor holding up a mirror to our species and forcing us to face the truth we've avoided. What if humanity's greatest discovery is not that we are not alone, but that we are not finished? That our story is still being written by us, and maybe, just maybe, with a little help from the stars.